All right, welcome back everybody to Founders Korner. Today I have a very special guest. Yes, I always call my guests special, but Eddie here is actually special because he's able to read your mind. So that's one thing I love about Eddie is he actually works with founders and is able to extract their ideas and present it to people like us, like Corridor or developers, and be able to actually give them deliverables in a massive way, which basically bridges the gap between development and idea. So let's give a warm applause for Eddie. Thank you for coming, man. I appreciate you taking the time.
Thank you for having me. It's great to be here.
So Eddie, tell our viewers, who are you? Why do you do what you do? Because what you do is very niche and I love it. So I'm just curious, how did you get into it?
Happy to. So I'm Eddie Irvin. I'm an app architect. If you want to go back to the beginning of me even working with websites, 20 years ago, starting with websites, 10 years ago with apps, really wanting to understand deeply how things worked, I think really is what drove me to try to understand this new thing of software and plugins and apps and how do you do it? After a while, got good enough to be able to do it as a freelancer, started working for an agency, and then I
like
built my own
development agency or just like
development
marketing?
agency.
Okay.
Yeah, exactly. Development agency. And then I was able to learn more about how they did things. And, every single week was an up leveling of my skill. And then after a while, I was realizing I can build my own business. And so I started working for friends building, plugins and apps and, mini web apps and things like that. And eventually just on and on and on. After being involved in so many projects, I realized that there was this big divide between having an idea, like, you have this thing, and then actually just making it physically happen and tie it to the ground.
And you worked with agencies, right? So
Yeah.
you know the challenge that happens between agency and founder.
Yep.
Because in my experience, you find a lot of disconnect that happens, and that's just due to like volume, I would say, because the agencies will have a high volume of people coming to them for development. How did you find that? Like, did you find that that gap was, even while you were there doing it, was the gap very like rushed because it was like hourly, we gotta get it going?
At that point in time, I was just taking directives from my lead. So I was really just working one-on-one with him where he's like, here's what you do, here's what's going on. So I was kind of separated in that specific job, separated from kind of the bigger conversation with the founder.
Right.
But you're totally right that this divide exists so much where non-technical founders or people that don't understand app development, they can just dream something up, and that it's the job of the developer to basically, come alongside them and understand them. And not only understand them, but be able to say back to them and communicate really well. And what happens more often than not with developers who don't communicate, it feels like an expensive game of telephone where the founder is asking for something. And then by the time it gets through the developer's finger to build the thing, and then it goes back to the founder, they're saying, what? That's not what I wanted. Exactly. That miscommunication and just getting information from one person to another down the chain until the person actually builds it, and then it going back to the founder and having it be the right thing is one piece. But another really interesting part of it is that sometimes founders, they think they have a good idea of what it is that they want. But, in my experience, as we talk more through it and really try to look at it from different angles, they may figure out that their first idea was only kind of the launching pad and that the real idea, it was there to be discovered.
It's interesting you say it from that perspective, because a lot of times what we'll see is the exact opposite. They'll have the big vision where they're trying to run to that vision, but they haven't done the base work to get there. So they're like, I want to do this. And I'm just like, well, how are you planning to build that up? That's a lot. I see that a lot with platforms. I don't know if you've noticed that, but with platforms, like people want to build platforms and I'm just like, that's not a small, like platform is you got two customers. It's hard enough to have one customer, when it comes to development or product selling. Like you're selling to one person is very hard with limited resources you have. So imagine you're coming now going, hey, I got two customers, and they'll give you that big vision and you're like, no, why don't you just start with this customer? Once you grow that customer base, then bring the other side. So I love that you said that sometimes they go the other way. With us, our experience is like they literally go for the big vision, and then we have to like almost like temper their expectation as well, right?
Well, and certainly that happens a lot too, where they've got kind of this like, oh, I'm going to do all this, or so, one of my clients had a bunch of apps that he wanted to do that were all going to be kind of interlinked. And people who haven't built apps before, they can't really break down in their mind like how much work that's actually going to be to make it technically happen. And then also what you're saying too with the platform, with just think about the marketing that's required to be able to use the thing that you build, for sure.
And it's not their fault when they're looking at things, when they're like looking at, like, let's take passwords as a really simple example. Everyone expects passwords to work. Like no matter where you're going, that's a lot of dev time to get passwords done right, right?
Mm.
And you're right. It's the lack of understanding slash, I don't know if they need to understand it, but they'll literally sit there and say, can we just add this one simple feature? And it's like, yeah, but that's not simple. That changes the architecture. That changes the
Right.
entire backend. That changes the entire function. So we get that so often. It's interesting that you're saying that you run into the same situation. So you did the agency thing, you went solo and you kind of did your own thing. So why do you do it? Like, what do you love about app architecture? And the reason I'm asking you is because I love app architecture. Like what you're doing is like one of my favorite things. What I do at Korner is to just like understand the business and try to not try, like we do it, but like I love coming up with the ideas in my head. So what excited you about it? Like what makes you about it?
That's a great question. To kind of bridge the gap from what I was saying before about kind of working for the agency, I ended up doing my own thing, but then also trying to build an agency as well, hiring developers, hiring managers, and doing that whole thing. So I
How
had a
did
lot
that
more
go?
work. It went well. It wasn't exactly what I needed to do. I thought I was going to have more free time because there's all these other people doing work, but
It
I
gets
was
the
the bottleneck.
exact opposite.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
But as a result of that, I had a lot more work flowing through. And so I really started focusing on the vision and the overall picture of what's going on. And then I would pass on those directives and then they would take care of the smaller pieces. But what I found is that in doing that work, that I ended up being more of the bridge as opposed to the technical, where I started, with the actual syntax and coding. And then I moved up to the communication level of just, trying to understand what are they aiming for. And like you said before, where, the founder comes in and says, oh, can you just do this one thing?
Right.
Immediately in my mind, I'm thinking downstream of all these different things, and you're not going to have that piece, and that's going to be harder. So I just got to start
Yeah.
building this. I don't know what happens in your mind, but for me, it's almost like these red flags and like
Yeah.
stuff. Just it's like, whoa, hold it. Like, what do you mean here?
Yeah. Mine
Go
is
ahead.
more like as soon as they give me ideas and thoughts, I'm instantly trying to solve the problem at the exact same time as they're speaking to me. So a
Yep.
lot of times they'll be like, I don't know if you've noticed this, and I'm curious if you see the same thing happen. I notice that people overcomplicate things. I don't know if you notice that. Like when they're explaining something to me, they almost like, here's my idea, here's my vision, and I have to do these 100 things for that to work. And you're just kind of like, yeah, but you can just do that very easily over here, like this, like that. And I think that comes from inexperience. I don't know if you experienced that at all, but
Well, yeah, the idea of somebody who's non-technical, like trying to explain to you like how something should work,
yes.
part of it is that the idea of just like, I understand that you don't know how it works, so I'm going to listen to you and make sure that I hear you out. Because
Yes.
also there might be some gold nuggets in there,
Correct.
but
Because you never
the
know.
idea of but the idea of like over explaining where they're saying they're trying to like be an architect or they're trying to be a
Yeah.
developer, which is awesome. I mean, I'm excited when people want to learn that stuff, but you're right. It's like all these extra things where it's like, you don't have to do it that way. You
Yeah.
could do it that way, but that's not the way I would do it. You
Yeah.
could do it this other way instead. But yeah, those challenges from a non-technical perspective when they're trying to explain how something technical should work, and you're just realizing there's a library for that,
Yeah.
or there's like,
Yeah.
download this thing over here, it's done.
Yeah, I remember when we were doing a client and they literally had, I think it was like 10 different softwares that they integrated to bootstrap their software. And it was like, yeah, but I could have just, like, if you just did a little bit more research, these three would have done all 10 of those.
Yeah.
But like they just pick at little things, right? Where they go, well, it has to have this one little feature. That's why I chose it. And it's like, but why, right? And so, yeah, I think at the end of the day, our jobs as you and I love to help them simplify things. Like that's to me, that's my biggest motto in life. It comes from Steve Jobs. Like simplicity is the ultimate sophistication. I hate crowded things. I hate complicated things. Like whenever we design our UI, UX, for example, our number one rule here is like, you're not allowed to do more than 3 clicks to get where you want to be.
I love that. I love
Right?
that.
And like,
Yeah.
that's a rule of thumb, right? That's like what you learn in UI, UX. And here we are, we're sitting there and we go into some of these softwares, you're like, oh my God, like I have to click like 1,000 buttons and I still don't know where I am. Right?
I love that. The balancing of it's got to be new and different and do something, something unique, but
Yeah.
then it also has to be simple is such a fight sometimes. In my experience, the idea is like you go for the complicated thing first and then you kind of start paring it down to what it needs to be.
Yes.
But always this balance where this is kind of connecting too with, pulling ideas out of founders and really just getting clear on like, what are we building here? Like, what are we doing? Is it just getting so clear is always a balance between what really matters to you. And what I find is that sometimes founders will come in with, it has to be this way, or like, it's, this has got to be this thing. And so, writing that down and taking note of it. But then as we circle back around and we see kind of more of the picture over here that's starting to really make sense, then they're seeing that thing that they really needed. And now it's kind of like, well, I don't really need that anymore. So that's something interesting, that they're trying to explain how it needs to happen, or they're so sure that they need this thing. But then when they're given, this bigger picture, or they just refine and they find those ideas that light them up even more than the original thing, then the original thing isn't like all important.
Close. Yeah, it's funny you say that, because I've mentioned it in my podcast before, but in our workshop that I was telling you about, we go through problem statement at least 3 or 4 times. The reason we do that, it's funny, because what they write the first time to what they have at the end is worlds of difference. Because at the end of the day, they kind of look at it and they go, well, do I actually really need that? Like, I kind of did some research. I actually don't need that as much as I thought I did, right? So I love that you say that, because like I said, I'm all about simplicity. And in my opinion, most software, the simpler they are, the faster you're going to trend.
I love that. And well, it's clear too, because as things are complicated and people just don't understand it, it doesn't make sense to me, or it's not working right.
Yeah.
They could potentially take some more time to learn if they had somebody coming alongside them or whatever it is, but they don't have that.
No.
They've got themselves.
That's
and
right.
in that moment, they have a choice. Either I'm going to figure this out, or I have to leave because I'm not getting success.
And that's how you get churn. Exactly. So let's say a founder comes to you and says, hey, Eddie, I love what you said. What is the biggest advice you'll give to like a founder who's just starting to think about their idea, or they're in the process of their idea? Just so our founder, our listeners know, I actually worked with Eddie, with one of our mutual clients. We're the dev side and Eddie was the extractor, is what I'll call you.
Yes.
And I think you did an amazing job with the client and how you were able to extract what his thought process is, but also convert it into an actual business concept rather than just it being an idea. I remember when I was walking away with him, I said, hey, look, that guy was amazing. Like, that's what he did. He's like, yeah, he pissed me off a lot because he asked me a lot of questions, but at the end of the day, it's exactly what we wanted. And I was like, but that's the point, right? Like, kids sit there and they're always like, but why? But why? But why? Right? Yeah. And we don't ask those questions. We don't ask the why question. We ask it once and it's like, okay, moving on, right? I don't want to annoy you. So I love that you annoyed him, because that's really what it is. You have to annoy them to like get it
First
out.
of all, I love that you're sharing this. And I can't agree more that for the times that I've been stubborn enough because it just doesn't make sense to me for some reason, there's something in the back of my mind that says, it's just not done.
Yeah.
That is so much better.
Like you ask.
Yeah, that is so much better than me just like trying not to step on toes, and then they go through the development and pay for this whole thing and then it breaks or it's wrong. I'd rather be a little bit more of a like, explain to me a little bit how this thing's gonna work, because typically what happens is either I have a breakthrough and I understand, then we can do this thing over here, or they realize, maybe I don't need that or whatever else it is. And then it settles down and then it feels right.
Yeah.
To answer your question, I have a specific answer for that. As you were saying, what's some advice to founders? Because, obviously if I'm working one-on-one with somebody, I can ask very specific questions. I can kind of go deep and, they can just kind of follow along and just kind of follow my process. Right. But if you're by yourself, and you are trying to further your app idea, what I would say is the best thing you can do is, let me kind of explain a quick story and then I'll give you kind of a specific directive to do. The idea is that when you pretend you're buying a house, the first time you go into the house, you kind of do this quick walkthrough. You're looking in this, you're kind of looking here. You don't look in all the nooks and crannies. You don't open up every single closet and look, you don't see all those things. But maybe the second time, or once you're like, I think we got to put in an offer for this thing, you start checking a little bit deeper. You find a few more things. You look a little bit deeper. And really with an app idea, that's what it's all about. The first time you go through in your mind, in your imagination, as you're imagining you are the perfect person to use the app and the app is fully functional and you're excited about using it. You're pretending you're that perfect person and you go through the app in your mind's eye. You can explain to yourself what's happening in a voice note. If you're using Telegram or WhatsApp, that's the way that I like doing it. But what I found is that I did this basically when I was giving directives to developers is where I figured this out.
You're talking about like recording yourself doing a walkthrough in the house, like as if the same as a user journey. So you're like literally like I'm logging in.
An audio version of user journey. And the whole point here is that the first time you go through in your mind's eye, you're kind of doing that quick little, like when you first go into a house, you're like, oh, this is cool. This room's cool. it's this top level sort of like, okay, good, good, good. Then the second time you go through, you're like, all right, but like, what about over there? And like, is there something up there? And like, what's over there? And what happens is you just start being way more thorough. That as time goes on, you kind of create a deeper and deeper rut. And eventually, as you do that walkthrough, you don't find anything new. Everything you're saying in that walkthrough, whether it's, 10 minutes of you just talking through what's happening, you're not finding anything. You're just saying the same thing you said last time. At that point, now you're in a fantastic place where you've now been thorough because you've given yourself enough time to be thorough and you're not finding anything else. And at that point, I would say you're pretty solid to move forward.
I actually love that idea, by the way, Eddie. Like just a recording of yourself. I've never thought of that. That was the first time I've heard it. So I'm going to credit you for that one.
Hey.
So here, let me ask you a question though. I can always see this happening when they're doing the walkthrough, like in the house, and they're thinking of their user journey. One thing I'll tell you right away, one problem that we always have is scope creeping, right? They'll walk through the house because a house is a physical thing. So like I can't really change it that easily. But when it's in my mind, I walk into the kitchen, let's say, and I'm going to go, yes, I'm going to have a 10-foot countertop, right? Cool. But then I'll be like, you know what? Actually, I'm going to make it 15-foot. How do you suggest that they kind of control themselves in that sense? Because that's how founders are. Entrepreneurs are dreamers by the definition, right? I always tell people, I'm like, being a founder is like jumping off a cliff and like you build a plane as you're falling to your death, essentially.
Yeah.
And so I always go back to sometimes you're building that plane, but then you're like, ooh, it would be nice to have 4 engines, not 2. So how do you control yourself from doing that?
That's a fantastic question. So a few things here. One is that people who have developed apps before and developed a lot of apps before can start to see and have a sense for when it's too much or when it's just wasteful. Go ahead.
I have a question for you because you mentioned the second time founders. What I always say this to people, the second time founders, you know how like your first time, you're always the big dreamer, the big idea, the big product. I've always noticed the second round people, they're like, how can I make it the simplest thing possible?
They learned the lesson.
Yeah,
they learned the
lesson.
Yeah.
That's right.
Absolutely. Yes. Well, so if you find yourself as you're thinking about your idea, if you're a first time founder, if you imagine that, 10-foot table and then it's a 20-foot table and then it's a 30-foot table, that's all well and good. And the thing is that everybody's got to go through that, right? So it's good to dream big. Ultimately, though, I would assume as you visit that same room, you don't just keep adding 10 more feet to the table. Like eventually you hit a limit where you're like, I don't need that. That's enough, right? And so that's the first part of it, is that you will hit a natural limit where you just go like, I don't need that. Or what happens is maybe the next time you walk in the room in your mind, and when we're talking, keep in mind, when we're talking about walking into a room, we're talking about imagining that the user's walking through an app. So going from like page to page, what's on the page, is the button here, the button there.
That's right.
Strip away, if you can, get rid of the size of the button, where the button is. Think more about what is success here.
Yeah.
What does success look like on this page? And there might be different levels of success.
Yeah.
But getting clear about objectives versus like the size of the button, because really somebody who really knows UI UX well is going to make way better decisions than if you've never designed anything. And that's something to keep in mind too, just kind of a nugget for if you're a first-time founder. Please don't try to be UI UX. Please don't try to be a designer. That it's good for you to kind of throw things together to be able to kind of present your idea, to communicate, but let people who you work with UI UX all the time decide, where the button should be, or if it's up here or down there. They're going to give you better ideas to choose from, and that'll be the best way to do it.
Yeah, I find when you give them ideas, you're steering them the wrong way.
Clarify that for me.
Like when you give an idea to UI and you say, hey, UI UX guy, do it this way. In my opinion, they actually mess up more than them doing it themselves because they have a vision. They're artists, right? So they have their own way.
Exactly. And so defining something like what success is giving the UI UX exactly what they need, because they can insert that into their brain that they've been working on for the past 20 years, focused on this specific task, and they can just make the UI UX happen, versus if you try to do their job for them and then they're trying to please you and then it ends up getting all muddled.
Well, you're wasting the art factor to it.
Yeah. So, as you're going through this app and you're kind of trying to figure out what's going on, you are going to start to hit limits. If you do think about button sizes or whatever else it is, all good. Let your imagination go. But eventually what happens is you stop having new ideas. You stop finding new things.
Right.
And so, don't keep adding on additions to the house either. That's a trick. Don't think
Yeah.
that you're going to make it better by making this thing 14,000 square feet. But eventually, naturally, it just starts to take so much shape that you can kind of recite it in your sleep. And then at that point, you've got this whole flow in your mind, at which point now you can really clarify successes on each individual page or across the entire app. And then one more thing there, prioritization. What we talked about before of how do you choose between this and that, and we've got to simplify and whatever else. There's always this trade-off between how much money is it going to be, what do we have to do for version 1, and it's this balancing act between all these different things. And so if you can at least get all your ideas out, then you're able to prioritize and then try to push that line up of like what you're actually going to build as high as you possibly can, still delighting your customer.
Yeah, and I think before you even get into that walkthrough, I think what you said about objectives, it's a thing that really, honestly, no one really does, or the idea. They're so focused on the product because the product is essentially their business, right? So naturally you over obsess over the product, but then you almost forget about what are you trying to achieve, and just taking that step back and always reflecting that objective. Like, look, I'm only trying to do this with this application for phase 1. So walking through my house, I'm not going to add an addition to that because that's your almost like point of truth is what I call it, right? Where you can always like bring that back and be like, does this help this objective? And I would say 80%, 70% of the time, you're going to say no. And it really helps you tame your expectations. And one thing you said, prioritization, we do I don't know if you've ever heard of this, but it's a must, should, could chart. Have you ever heard of that?
Cool. I haven't, but I love it.
Yeah, like literally sticky note. Here's the feature. Is this a must? Like if you don't have it, will you lose the business, right?
Right.
A should is like, I should probably have 2-factor authentication, but it's not like a must. Like it's not going to make or break the product, right? And then finally, could. Like this is your wish list. This is all the things that really don't relate to the objective, but it will add an enticing aspect to the product. That's how I always start is like, what's the objective? Let's come up with a goal. What's this product going to do? And let's stick to that.
Yep. And holding that as the guiding light versus when you were saying that, I was realizing that founders are sometimes it's easy to think about like, oh, it's going to be so cool and it's going to look like this and they're so focused on sometimes how the whole thing's going to work, but then they're missing, well, why are people using it to begin with? Yeah. And the fact of the matter is that if there's no point, people aren't going to use a flashy app.
Yeah.
If you focus on what the point is, even if it's not the flashiest app in the world, but it helps them do something that they really want to do, they're going to love it.
And that's a beauty. Yeah. They go too big picture and not enough on the focal point, which is what are you doing? Why are you building this business? Because at the end of the day, it's an expensive hobby if you don't do the why, right? Like if you don't have a why as to why you're doing this and that's not your guiding beacon, like literally you are focused on that and that only, it becomes a very expensive hobby. Like this, you've probably dealt with like some people like that, right? It's not cheap. So you want to do it as right as possible the first time, and really measuring 2, 3, or 4 times is absolutely critical.
100%. And the people that maybe haven't done this before don't realize, what can go wrong or how wrong things can turn out if they, go down this way or go down that way. They forget that. It's much better to take more time in planning, to take more time to make sure you're headed the right direction than building the wrong thing fast. Just build something. We just need to get something out there. Yes and no. If you end up with the wrong thing, you could have used them.
You're going to pivot. If you come up with the wrong thing, you're going to pivot, and that pivot is going to burn more cash flow. Your burn rate is going to go up again, and you just delayed another 6-8 months, right?
Yep.
And I think that's why second-time founders and like multi-founders, they always keep the second project as simple as possible, right? And I think that is why.
Yeah.
Because it's no longer about, oh, I want to go big. It's like, no. What's my niche? The one thing, the one customer, the one channel, and then they just go nuts on it.
And once you connect that, if you go small and you build what you need to build, but you don't try to just build this whole big thing, you actually connect to the market.
Yeah.
You actually build this thing. It connects to the market. You post it down in the ground and people can actually come and start using it, which really at that point, you then are able to, if you have cash flow, you're able to throw money into V2. You're able to upgrade it. You're able to listen to the customers that are coming in and saying, let's make this even better, because you're connected to the market and not just floating free to try to build this monstrous thing.
That's right. Eddie, I really appreciate your time and your knowledge, your intelligence. We've had a couple of conversations and they've always been great. I absolutely love the fact that we did this on a podcast because I think honestly, a lot of people that are going to listen to this, they're going to actually be able to walk away with a lot. So I really appreciate what you gave in terms of advice and comments. Any final thoughts? First of all, I want to say you can find Eddie on Instagram. What's the Instagram handle?
Instagram, it's at SA Playbook. If you want to email me directly, it's eddie@saplaybook.com.
Perfect. And yeah, if you have any questions or you found Eddie's comments helpful, feel free to reach out. But otherwise, Eddie, thank you so much for your time, man. I really appreciate it. And to all the founders out there, thank you all for listening. Until next time, Corridor out.